In this video, we're going to talk about run-on sentences, and this video should supplement the information that you find in our Blackboard shell. You may also want to take a look at the chapter on run-on sentences in your Rules for Writers book. That begins on page 173 and ends on page 177. Rules for Writers will give you more examples than the ones I'm going to go over in this video. So let's go ahead and get into it. The first thing that we're going to need to do is to define what a run-on sentence is and how to find one. And the best way for us to do that is to go back in time and think first about what a simple sentence is. A simple sentence is also known as an independent clause, and it is made up of a subject, a noun that is doing an action, and a verb, the action word. The simple sentence is oftentimes completed with a verb phrase, and it must be a complete thought. So if we think about a subject, a verb, or a verb and a verb phrase, that is what makes our simple sentence. So to review and go back to the lesson that we did on compound sentences, you can take a look at the two simple sentences on the screen. The first one is Warsan Shire writes poetry. The second one is home is about the experience of refugees. In the first instance, Warsan Shire is your subject. She is the thing that is doing the action. Writes is your verb. It is the action word. And writes poetry is the verb in the verb phrase or your predicate. In the second example, home is your subject. Is your verb. It's a linking verb. And is about the experience of refugees is your verb phrase or your predicate. So these are two simple sentences. So every time we have a subject, verb, and complete thought unit on our hands, we know we need to think that we have two simple sentences, or we have a simple sentence on our hand. So when we're writing, sometimes we accidentally combine sentences incorrectly, and that is what's called a run-on sentence. So if you take a look at the first example, Warsan Shire writes poetry, home is about the experiences of refugees. Notice that in between these two independent clauses, there is nothing. There is no unit of punctuation that is connecting them together. There is no signal word that is connecting them together. And so this is a form of a run-on. Run-ons happen when you have two independent clauses or two simple sentences that are jammed together or that are run together incorrectly. And so the first one is an example of what is called a fused sentence. The second example is also a type of run-on sentence. This time we see a comma that occurs between the first independent clause and the second independent clause. Warsan Shire writes poetry, comma, home is about the experience of refugees. However, this is still an error. The comma is not a strong enough punctuation mark to be able to hold those two sentences together. And so this is what we would call a comma splice. Here are two more examples that come from the Rules for Writers textbook. The first one is a fused sentence. Air pollution poses risks to all humans. It can be deadly for asthma sufferers. We see the independent clause, number one here, and the second independent clause here. We know those are independent clauses because they have one subject, one verb, and a complete thought. So air pollution is your subject, poses risks is your verb phrase, poses risk to all humans is your predicate. Then in the second part of the sentence, it is your subject, can be is your verb phrase, and can be deadly for asthma sufferers is your predicate phrase. So notice there is nothing in between those two independent clauses. That is what makes that sentence error. In this case, it is a run-on sentence and a fused sentence. The second example, where we put a comma in between those two independent clauses, is still an error. Again, the comma is not a strong enough punctuation mark to join those two independent clauses together. So now that we know how to identify a run-on sentence, well, what do we do about them? What do we do when we accidentally write them, or what do we do when we find them in a piece of writing that we're editing for a classmate or for a friend? Well, there are a couple of ways that you can fix a run-on sentence. The first way is that you can add a comma and a coordinating conjunction or a fanboys word. Now, I said a comma on its own was not strong enough, and that's true, but a comma with a coordinating conjunction is strong enough to join two simple sentences to become a compound sentence. So here's the example. Air pollution causes risks to all humans, comma, but it can be deadly to asthma sufferers. That is a correct compound sentence. Another way you can do this is by adding a semicolon and a conjunctive adverb. Air pollution causes risk to all humans, semicolon, therefore, comma, it can be deadly to asthma sufferers. So the glue of the comma and the coordinating conjunction and the glue of the semicolon, the conjunctive adverb, and the comma are strong enough to hold those two ideas together. Now, we no longer have a run-on sentence on our hands. few other ways that we can correct a run-on sentence is that we can add just a semicolon. This can only be done if the relationship between the two simple sentences is very clear. So here's an example. Air pollution causes risks to all humans. It can be deadly to asthma sufferers. Probably not the best sentence because the relationship between those two ideas is not as clear as it could be. You really need a word like but or however in between there to make that logic clear. But the second one has a very obvious cause and effect logic. I stayed up too late, semicolon, I'm tired, right? We see the cause and effect logic there. So you can combine those two sentences with just a semicolon. You can think of a semicolon as being like a junior period. It's almost as strong as a period, but not quite, and it can join two simple sentences together in some situations. Let's move on, look at a few more. Another way that we can fix a run-on sentence is just by separating the two independent clauses with a period. This is probably the most easy way to correct a run-on sentence. So if you can take a look at the example, air pollution causes risks to all humans, period, capital I, it can be deadly to asthma sufferers. We can also rewrite the run-on sentence as a complex sentence. So instead of joining it in the middle, we can decide to perhaps join it in the beginning. So this time we have although air pollution causes risks to all humans, comma, it can be deadly to asthma sufferers. Remember that in this case, the comma is existing between these two clauses because now this first clause is no longer an independent clause, it's a dependent clause. And when we write complex sentences which have subordinate conjunctions in the beginning, we must put a comma in between the independent clause and the dependent clause. And if you're a little fuzzy on that, go back and watch the video on complex sentences. We do want to make sure that we avoid this mistake, that when we are rewriting a run-on sentence as a complex sentence, that we don't include both a subordinating conjunction and a coordinating conjunction. We really only need one. You can think of these conjunction words as linking words. What they do is glue your ideas together. And so you don't need the glue or the cement in two places. So this mistake here, although air pollution causes risks to all humans, but it can be deadly to asthma sufferers. In this case, you either need the although or you need the but. So we want to be sure to avoid that mistake. Let's do a couple more examples. The examples on the screen now come from your Rules for Writers textbook, and you may want to take a couple moments to pause the video and try to practice rewriting these on your own. Okay, so let's go over the first example. There's a number of ways that you can rewrite this sentence correctly. So we'll take a look at the first one. We have wind power for the home is a supplementary source of energy. It can be combined with electricity, gas, or solar energy. This is a comma splice. This is a run-on sentence, is a comma splice. Our first independent clause is here. Wind power for the home is a supplementary source of energy. And our second independent clause starts here. It can be combined with electricity, gas, or solar power. Again, the reason we know that is because we have our subject, which is wind power, and we have our verb, which is, and our predicate phrase. Then in the second part, we have our subject, which is it. We have our verb phrase, can be, and the rest of the predicate, what can be combined with, can be combined with electricity, gas, or solar energy. So here's a couple of different ways to fix this. We can put a period in between the two independent clauses, making them two separate sentences. These ideas are closely related enough that instead of a period, we can use a semicolon. And you would use a semicolon instead of a period when you want to emphasize the connectivity between the two ideas. Or a third way is that we can write a compound sentence, keep these sentences the same, and this time add a comma and a fanboy's word or coordinating conjunction. In this case, wind power for the home is a supplementary source of energy, comma, and it can be combined with electricity, gas, or solar. Here's another example. Aidan viewed Sofia Coppola's Lost in Translation 3 times and then wrote a paper describing the film as the work of a mysterious modern painter. Well, if you had a time figuring out how to fix this one, it's because it's actually correct. This is not a run-on sentence. It is a simple sentence with what is called a compound predicate. In this case, we have only one subject, Aidan, and then we have two verbs, viewed and then wrote. So our first verb and predicate phrase is Aidan viewed Sofia Coppola's Lost in Translation 3 times. And our second predicate phrase is wrote a paper describing the film as the work of a mysterious modern painter. So there's nothing wrong with this sentence. It does not need to be corrected at all. Last one that we'll cover. In the Middle Ages, the streets of London were dangerous places. It was safer to travel by boat along the Thames. In this case, we have a comma splice again. We have a subject, which is the streets of London, the streets of London. And you have the verb, which is were, and you have the predicate phrase, were dangerous places. Then on the other side of the comma, we have it is our next subject. Was is your verb. Was safer to travel by boat along the Thames is your predicate phrase. So we do need to fix this one. This is a comma splice. Two ways that we can fix this example. We can turn it into a complex sentence by putting a subordinating conjunction at the beginning of the sentence and rewriting it as, because in the Middle Ages, the streets of London were dangerous places, it was safer to travel by boat. Or we can add a a semicolon and a conjunctive adverb followed by a comma in order to create a compound sentence. In the Middle Ages, the streets of London were dangerous places, semicolon, therefore, comma, it was safer to travel by boat along the Thames. So the Rules for Writers textbook will cover a variety of ways to fix run-on sentences, the same ones that were covered in this video. And I would suggest that you reread the chapter before taking the quiz that is in this week's Blackboard.